Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition meet modern scandal, a battle for power has been quietly raging. What happens when the woman who waited decades to become queen consort discovers that her carefully crafted plans are crumbling? When whispered conversations in palace corridors become explosive confrontations? When a king must choose between love and duty, between his wife and his crown? This is not just another royal story. This is the untold drama of manipulation, betrayal, and the ultimate test of royal authority. A story where phone calls are secretly recorded, where trusted allies become enemies overnight, and where the very foundation of the modern monarchy hangs in the balance. You're about to witness how quickly a queen's dreams can become a king's nightmare, and how the most powerful family in Britain fights its battles behind closed doors. The crown jewels may sparkle, but the truth behind them is far darker than anyone could imagine. Prepare yourself for a tale that will change everything you thought you knew about the British royal family. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Clarence House as Camilla Parker Bowles stood at her bedroom window, watching the early morning joggers in St. James's Park. She had been queen consort for 18 months now, a title she had dreamed of for over 3 decades. Yet something felt terribly wrong. The phone call she had received the previous evening from her private secretary still echoed in her mind like a warning bell. Charles was in his study, as he had been every morning for the past week, locked away with papers and making phone calls that he refused to discuss with her. Their breakfast conversations had become stilted, formal affairs that reminded her uncomfortably of the early days of their relationship when everything had to be hidden, calculated, and carefully planned. She had worked too hard and waited too long to let everything slip away now. The transformation from the other woman to queen consort had required years of careful public relations, strategic charitable work, and the gradual winning over of a skeptical British public. She had weathered the storms of Diana's death, the public's initial hatred, and decades of scandal. Now, finally, wearing the crown she had always believed was rightfully hers, she wasn't about to let anyone take it away. The previous evening's phone call had been from Margaret Thornfield, her most trusted advisor and the architect of many of her successful public relations campaigns. Margaret's voice had been unusually tense as she delivered the news that certain members of Parliament were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about Camilla's influence over the king. There were whispers in Westminster about decisions being made in the queen consort's drawing room rather than in the proper channels of government. These weren't just idle rumors. Margaret had learned from her contacts in Downing Street that several senior ministers had expressed concerns about what they perceived as Camilla's growing political involvement. The Prime Minister himself had apparently made a comment about the Queen Consort's opinions being offered rather too freely during what should have been routine ceremonial meetings. Camilla knew she had perhaps been too eager to embrace her new role. After decades of being kept in the shadows, the opportunity to finally have a real voice in royal affairs had been intoxicating. She had begun offering her thoughts on everything from foreign policy to domestic legislation, believing that her years of observation and her understanding of public opinion made her insights valuable. But she had underestimated how closely she was being watched. Every suggestion she made, every opinion she offered, every private conversation she had with Charles was apparently being noted and analyzed by people whose job it was to protect the constitutional monarchy from any hint of improper influence. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years learning to play by royal rules, understanding that everything had to appear proper and constitutional. Yet now that she had finally achieved the position she had always wanted, those same rules were being used to constrain her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Charles emerged from his study looking older than his 74 years. The weight of kingship had aged him visibly since his mother's death, but lately there was something else in his expression. A wariness that hadn't been there before, especially when he looked at her. "Good morning, my dear," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone that had crept into their conversations lately. "Charles, we need to talk," Camilla replied, setting down her coffee cup with a firmness that made him pause. She had decided during her sleepless night that directness was her best strategy. Years of careful maneuvering had brought her this far, but now she sensed that subtlety might be working against her. If there were concerns about her influence, she needed to know exactly what they were and how to address them. "I've been hearing things, Charles. Uncomfortable things about my role, and about how certain people perceive my involvement in your duties." Charles settled into his chair with the careful movements of a man, choosing his words very deliberately. "Camilla, You must understand that the role of queen consort is different from what you might have imagined. There are boundaries, constitutional boundaries, that we cannot cross. The way he said, "we," felt like a warning, and Camilla felt the first real flutter of fear in her chest. She had expected him to dismiss her concerns, to reassure her that together they could weather any political storm as they had weathered so many personal ones. What exactly are you saying, Charles? I'm saying that perhaps you've been a bit too enthusiastic in offering your opinions on matters that fall outside the traditional scope of the consort's role. The words stung more than she had expected. This was Charles, the man who had once told her that her intelligence and political insight were among the qualities he most valued in her. Now he was suggesting that those same qualities were somehow inappropriate. I've only been trying to help, to support you in the way I thought you wanted. I know your intentions are good, my dear, but intentions aren't always enough when it comes to constitutional matters. There was something in his tone that suggested this conversation had been building for longer than she had realized. Charles wasn't simply responding to recent political pressure. He was expressing doubts that had been growing for some time. Margaret Thornfield had warned her that this moment might come. During their many strategy sessions over the years, they had discussed the possibility that Charles might eventually feel torn between his personal loyalty to Camilla and his duty as king. Margaret had always insisted that when that moment arrived, Camilla would need to be prepared to fight for her position with every weapon in her considerable arsenal. Charles, I think we both know that my support has been crucial to your success as king. The public accepts me now in a way they never did before. We've built something together, something that goes beyond just our personal relationship. She was reminding him of the political reality. The careful rehabilitation of Camilla's public image had been one of the monarchy's great public relations successes. Polling showed that the British public now viewed her favorably, seeing her as a stabilizing influence on Charles and a hard-working member of the royal family. But Charles's expression didn't soften as she had hoped it would. Instead, he looked at her with what she could only interpret as a mixture of sadness and determination. Camilla, the monarchy's survival depends on its ability to remain above party politics and constitutional controversy. If your role is becoming a source of concern for the government, then we need to address that concern. And how exactly do you propose we address it? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Camilla knew she was pushing him to state explicitly what he was only hinting at, but she needed to know how serious this threat really was. Charles stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the same view Camilla had contemplated earlier. When he turned back to her, she saw something in his face that made her stomach drop. The Prime Minister has requested a private meeting with me this afternoon. He's asked specifically that you not be informed of the timing or location. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. Not only was Charles meeting with the Prime Minister about her without her knowledge, but he was telling her about it in a way that made clear he considered the request reasonable. You're going to meet with him? Without me? To discuss me? I'm going to listen to what he has to say. As king, that's my duty. And as my husband? What's your duty there? The question seemed to catch him off guard, and for a moment she saw a flicker of the Charles she had fallen in love with decades ago. The man who had once been willing to sacrifice everything for their relationship. Camilla, you have to understand. The constitutional concerns are serious. There are suggestions that you've been influencing policy decisions, that you've been present during meetings where you shouldn't have been present, that you've been offering opinions on matters where the queen consort traditionally remains silent. She felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. These weren't just vague political concerns. They were specific allegations that could threaten not just her influence, but her entire position. Who's making these suggestions, Charles? Who's been watching us and reporting back? That's not the point. The point is that if these concerns exist, we need to address them before they become a real constitutional crisis. But it was exactly the point, as far as Camilla was concerned. Someone in their inner circle, someone with access to their private conversations and daily routine, had been reporting her activities to people outside the palace. The careful network of loyalty she thought she had built around herself had been compromised. Margaret Thornfield had always warned her that the royal household was full of people whose ultimate loyalty was to the institution rather than to any individual member of the royal family. Camilla had thought her years of careful relationship building had protected her from that kind of betrayal, but apparently she had been wrong. The realization that she might have enemies within the palace itself was almost as disturbing as Charles's apparent willingness to throw her to the political wolves. She had spent years learning to navigate royal protocol and constitutional requirements, but she had underestimated the extent to which others were watching and judging her every move. Charles, if I've made mistakes, we can correct them. We can clarify my role, adjust my level of involvement. But you can't just cut me out of important decisions about my own future. This isn't about cutting you out, Camilla. This is about protecting the monarchy. And sometimes protecting the monarchy requires difficult decisions. The formal way he spoke made her feel as if she were speaking to the king rather than to her husband. And she realized that might be exactly what was happening. Charles was choosing his role as monarch over his role as her partner, just as Margaret had always feared he might. But Camilla hadn't survived decades of scandal and public hatred by giving up at the first sign of serious opposition. She had learned to fight for what she wanted, and she had learned to use every advantage at her disposal. I hope you remember, Charles, that I know where all the bodies are buried. Our relationship has given me access to information and insights that others don't have. If I'm forced to defend myself publicly, I'll use whatever resources are available to me. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. She was reminding him that their decades together had given her knowledge of his weaknesses, his mistakes, and his private opinions on matters that could prove embarrassing if they became public. Charles's face hardened in a way that told her the threat had been both understood and resented. I hope you're not suggesting that you would use private conversations between us as some kind of weapon, Camilla. I'm suggesting that I won't go quietly if people are trying to push me out of a role I've earned and deserve. The battle lines were being drawn more clearly than either of them had intended. What had started as a conversation about political concerns was becoming a confrontation about the fundamental nature of their relationship and their respective positions within the monarchy. Perhaps, Charles said quietly, we should both take some time to consider our positions before this conversation goes any further. As he left the room, Camilla remained standing by the window, watching the ordinary people in the park going about their ordinary lives. She envied them their freedom from the constant scrutiny and calculation that defined her existence. But she also knew that she would fight with everything she had to keep the position she had worked so hard to achieve. The conversation with Charles had shown her just how serious the threat was, but it had also shown her that she couldn't count on his protection. She would have to protect herself, and she would have to do it in a way that reminded everyone involved just how much power she still held. The game was far from over, and Camilla Parker Bowles had not survived this long by surrendering when the stakes were highest. Margaret Thornfield arrived at Clarence's house within an hour of Camilla's urgent phone call. As one of the most connected public relations advisors in London, Margaret had built her career on managing crises for powerful people, but she had never seen Camilla look quite so rattled. The Queen Consort was pacing her private sitting room like a caged animal, her usual composure completely abandoned. They want me gone, Margaret. Charles is meeting with the Prime Minister this afternoon, and I'm specifically not invited. After everything we've built, after all these years, they're treating me like I'm some kind of liability. Margaret settled into her usual chair and opened her leather portfolio. She had been expecting this call for weeks, ever since her contacts in Westminster had begun sharing increasingly specific concerns about Camilla's growing political profile. Tell me exactly what Charles said to you this morning. Every word you can remember. As Camilla recounted the conversation, Margaret made careful notes, watching for the subtle details that would tell her how serious the threat really was. The fact that Charles was willing to attend a meeting specifically designed to exclude Camilla suggested that the pressure from Downing Street was more intense than they had initially realized. The constitutional concerns they're raising aren't entirely without merit, Margaret said carefully. You have been more politically active than previous queen consorts. The question is whether we can turn that into a strength rather than allowing it to be seen as a weakness. What do you mean? I mean we need to control the narrative before someone else does. If they want to paint you as an overreaching queen consort, we need to paint you as an effective and engaged partner to the king. The public relations battle is going to be just as important as the political one. Margaret had been working on contingency plans for exactly this scenario. Her network of journalists, politicians, and palace insiders had been carefully cultivated over decades, and she knew how to use that network to shape public opinion when her clients faced serious threats. We have several advantages, she continued. Your public approval ratings are the highest they've ever been. The charitable work you've done as queen consort has been genuinely impressive. And, most importantly, the public sees you as a stabilizing influence on Charles. If we can frame this as an attack on a hard-working queen consort by jealous politicians, we can turn public opinion in our favor. But Camilla wasn't interested in a defensive strategy. Years of being attacked and Having to justify her very existence had taught her that the best defense was often a devastating offense. I want to know who's been reporting on me, Margaret. Someone in the palace has been feeding information to outsiders, and I want to know who it is. I've already started making inquiries. My sources suggest that the concerns didn't originate from within the palace itself, but from government ministers who've been present during some of your interactions with Charles. It's possible that you've been overheard during supposedly private moments. The idea that government ministers had been deliberately listening to and reporting private conversations was both infuriating and frightening. It suggested a level of organized opposition that went beyond simple political disagreement. They've been spying on me. They've been doing their jobs as they see them. Government ministers take oaths to protect the constitutional system, and if they believe that system is being threatened, they're obligated to report their concerns. Margaret's pragmatic response frustrated Camilla, who wanted someone to share her outrage. But she also knew that Margaret's cold analysis was exactly what she needed if she was going to successfully fight back. So what do? We gather our own information. We find out exactly what concerns have been raised, who raised them, and what solutions are being discussed. Then, we develop a strategy that addresses the legitimate concerns while protecting your position. Margaret already had a plan in motion. Her assistant had spent the morning reaching out to contacts in Downing Street, trying to learn the specific details of the government's concerns. The information she was gathering would allow them to craft a response that appeared cooperative while actually strengthening Camilla's position. I've also been thinking about our other assets, Margaret continued. Your relationship with the press has improved dramatically over the past few years. There are several journalists who would be very interested in hearing your side of this story, especially if we can frame it properly. The suggestion made Camilla pause. Using the press to fight political battles was a dangerous game, especially for members of the royal family who were supposed to remain above such conflicts. But she had played dangerous games before and won. What kind of story are you thinking about? A profile piece. Something that shows you as a dedicated queen consort who's been working tirelessly to support the king and serve the British people. We can include some carefully chosen details about the challenges you face and the unfair criticism you've endured. Nothing that directly attacks the government, but something that makes clear you're being treated unjustly. Margaret had already identified the perfect journalist for such a piece. Rebecca Manning from the Times had written favorably about Camilla in the past and had a reputation for producing sympathetic profiles of public figures under pressure. More importantly, Rebecca's articles were widely read by exactly the kind of educated, politically aware readers whose opinions mattered most in this kind of constitutional debate. But even as they discussed media strategy, both women knew that the real battle would be fought behind the scenes. The meeting between Charles and the Prime Minister that afternoon would determine whether Camilla faced a minor adjustment to her role or a fundamental challenge to her position. I need to know what they're saying in that meeting, Margaret. I'm working on it. I have contacts who might be able to provide some insight, but it will take time. Time was exactly what Camilla felt she didn't have. Every hour that passed without her knowing what was being discussed was an hour in which decisions might be made about her future without her input. The afternoon stretched endlessly as Camilla waited for news of Charles's meeting with the Prime Minister. She tried to maintain her normal schedule, attending a pre-planned charity lunch and meeting with her private secretary about upcoming engagements. But her mind was entirely focused on what was happening behind closed doors at Downing Street. Margaret called twice with updates from her contacts, but the information was frustratingly vague. The meeting was lasting longer than initially planned, which could mean either that serious decisions were being made or that Charles was successfully defending Camilla's position. When Charles finally returned to Clarence's house that evening, his expression told Camilla everything she needed to know before he said a word. The meeting had not gone well for her. What did they want, Charles? They want assurances that your role will be more clearly defined going forward. There are concerns that the line between your public duties and your private influence has become blurred. What kind of assurances? Charles settled heavily into his chair, looking every one of his 74 years. The weight of the crown had never seemed heavier than it did at that moment. They want you to step back from certain types of meetings. They want your schedule to be reviewed by the Cabinet Office before approval. And they want a clear protocol established for any future political involvement. Each requirement felt like a slap in the face. The suggestion that her schedule needed government approval was particularly galling, as it treated her like a potential security threat rather than the queen consort. And you agreed to this? I agreed to consider their concerns. Camilla, you have to understand the position I'm in. The government has the power to create a genuine constitutional crisis if they choose to do so. We have to work within the system, not against it. But Camilla had spent too many years fighting for her position to accept these restrictions without a battle. The careful plans she and Margaret had been discussing suddenly seemed not just advisable, but absolutely necessary. I think they're underestimating me, Charles. I think they believe I'll just quietly accept whatever limitations they want to impose. And won't you? The question revealed more about Charles's expectations than Camilla was comfortable with. He was assuming that she would prioritize his comfort and the institution's stability over her own position and dignity. No, Charles, I won't. I've earned my place in this family and in this institution. I'm not going to let a few nervous politicians take that away from me. That evening, after Charles had retired to his study to deal with his boxes of official papers, Camilla called Margaret with new instructions. The time for defensive strategies had passed. If the government wanted a battle over her role and influence, she would give them one. I want that profile piece set up immediately, she told Margaret. And I wanted to make clear that I've been the target of an organized campaign by people who resent my influence and my effectiveness. Are you sure you want to escalate to that level? Once we go public with this, there's no going back. There's already no going back, Margaret. They've made their move, and now it's time for me to make mine. Margaret understood. After decades of managing crises for powerful people, she knew when a client had reached the point where they would rather risk everything than accept defeat. Camilla had reached that point. I'll contact Rebecca Manning first thing in the morning. We'll need to be very careful about how we frame this, but I think we can create a compelling narrative. I want more than a compelling narrative, Margaret. I want consequences for the people who are trying to push me out. I want them to understand that attacking me comes with a price. The conversation with Margaret continued late into the night as they refined their strategy. By the time Camilla finally went to bed, she had approved a plan that would fundamentally change her relationship with both the government and the press. The next morning, Rebecca Manning received a call that she had been hoping for but hadn't expected so soon. The opportunity to interview the Queen Consort during a moment of constitutional tension was exactly the kind of exclusive access that could define a journalist's career. Within hours, arrangements were being made for what would become one of the most controversial royal interviews in recent memory. Camilla was about to tell her side of the story, and she was about to do it in a way that would force everyone involved to choose sides. The battle for Camilla's position as Queen Consort was about to become very public, and the consequences would reach far beyond the walls of any royal residence. She had decided that if she was going to be destroyed, she would make sure that her enemies paid a price for the destruction. Charles would learn that afternoon about the interview that had been arranged without his knowledge or approval. The government would learn about it when Rebecca Manning began making calls to verify the Queen Consort's claims. And the British public would learn about it when the Times published a profile that would shake the foundations of the modern constitutional monarchy. The game was entering a new and far more dangerous phase, and Camilla Parker Bowles was about to remind everyone involved exactly why they had once feared her enough to try to keep her away from the throne. The interview with Rebecca Manning took place in Camilla's private sitting room at Clarence House, a space that had been carefully arranged to project both intimacy and authority. Fresh flowers from the royal gardens, family photographs strategically positioned, and afternoon light streaming through windows that overlooked the park all contributed to an atmosphere that suggested warmth and accessibility while maintaining unmistakable royal dignity. Rebecca Manning had arrived with her photographer and a list of carefully prepared questions, but she could see within minutes that Camilla had her own agenda for this conversation. The Queen Consort was dressed impeccably in a navy blue suit that conveyed both professionalism and approachability, but there was a steely determination in her eyes that suggested this interview would be anything but routine. I want to talk about the reality of being Queen Consort. Camilla began before Rebecca had even finished setting up her recording equipment. I think people have misconceptions about what this role requires and what challenges we face in trying to serve the British people effectively. Margaret Thornfield watched from across the room, occasionally making notes, but mostly observing the careful dance between journalist and subject. This interview had been planned as a defensive move, but Camilla was clearly intent on making it an offensive weapon. Your Majesty, there have been some suggestions recently that your role has expanded beyond what some consider traditional for a queen consort. How do you respond to those concerns? I respond by pointing out that the monarchy has always evolved with the times. When I became queen consort, I didn't become a museum piece. I became a working member of a modern royal family with responsibilities to match those of the current era. Rebecca could sense there was more beneath the surface, and she pressed gently for specifics. Can you give me an example of how your role differs from previous queen consorts? I think my husband values my opinion on a wide range of subjects, just as any successful partnership involves mutual consultation and support. The idea that a queen consort should be seen and not heard belongs to a different century. The comment was carefully calculated to sound reasonable while actually making a pointed criticism of anyone who expected her to remain silent during important discussions. Margaret had coached Camilla to frame her political involvement as natural marital consultation rather than constitutional overreach. Have you faced criticism for this approach? I've faced criticism my entire adult life, Camilla replied with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. I've learned that criticism often comes from people who are uncomfortable with women who refuse to be diminished or silenced. The feminist angle was Margaret's suggestion. By framing opposition to her political involvement as a form of sexism, Camilla could appeal to progressive opinion while positioning her critics as outdated traditionalists. But Rebecca Manning was too experienced to accept such deflections without follow-up questions. Specifically, there are reports that some government ministers have expressed concerns about your level of involvement in meetings with the king. Can you address those reports directly? This was the moment Camilla had been preparing for, the opportunity to turn defense into attack. I think those reports tell us more about the people making them than they do about my behavior. When government ministers spend their time monitoring and reporting on private conversations between a husband and wife, I think we have to ask what their real motivations are. The accusation was subtle but devastating. Camilla was suggesting that government officials were engaging in inappropriate surveillance while implying that their motivations were political rather than constitutional. Are you suggesting that government ministers have been deliberately monitoring your private conversations? I'm suggesting that someone has been reporting private conversations to people outside the palace, and I think the British public deserves to know who that is and why they consider it appropriate. Rebecca felt the excitement that came with realizing she was getting exactly the kind of exclusive content that would dominate headlines for days. The Queen Consort was essentially accusing government officials of spying on the royal family. That's a very serious allegation, Your Majesty. It's a very serious situation. When elected officials believe they have the right to monitor and control the private conversations of the royal family, I think we're moving into dangerous constitutional territory. Camilla was expertly reversing the narrative. Instead of being accused of constitutional overreach, she was positioning herself as the defender of royal independence against government interference. Margaret watched with professional admiration as Camilla continued to build her case. This wasn't just damage control. This was a masterful example of offensive public relations that would put her opponents on the defensive. What would you like to see happen going forward? I'd like to see a return to mutual respect between the royal family and the government. I'd like to see an end to the kind of behind-the-scenes maneuvering that treats members of the royal family like political pawns. And I'd like to see recognition that the Queen Consort's role in the 21st century might be different from what it was in previous eras. The interview continued for another 40 minutes, with Camilla carefully building a narrative that portrayed her as a hard-working, unfairly criticized Queen Consort who was being undermined by jealous politicians. She spoke movingly about her charitable work, her dedication to supporting the king, and her commitment to serving the British people. But the most damaging moments came when she discussed the personal cost of the recent political pressure. It's been very difficult for my husband, she said at one point, allowing just a trace of vulnerability to show in her voice. He's trying to balance his constitutional duties with his desire to protect his family. No one should have to choose between their public responsibilities and their private loyalties. The comment was designed to put Charles in an impossible position. If he failed to defend her after this interview, he would appear to be abandoning his wife under political pressure. If he did defend her, he would be positioning himself against the government that had raised concerns about her role. Rebecca Manning left Clarence House with enough material for a major feature article, but also with the uncomfortable feeling that she had been used as a weapon in a battle she didn't fully understand. The Queen Consort had been charming, articulate, and completely in control throughout the interview. But there had been moments when Rebecca sensed she was seeing something harder and more calculating beneath the surface. That evening, Charles returned from his royal duties to find Camilla in unusually high spirits. She was humming softly as she arranged flowers in the drawing room, and she greeted him with a warmth that had been absent from their recent interactions. You seem pleased about something, he observed cautiously. I had a productive afternoon. I gave an interview to Rebecca Manning from the Times. Charles felt his blood pressure spike. You did what? I told our side of the story, Charles. I explained the truth about my role and about the unfair pressure we've been facing. Camilla, you can't give interviews about constitutional matters without consultation. You can't make public statements about ongoing political discussions. I can't, or you'd prefer I didn't? The distinction was important, and Charles recognized it immediately. Camilla wasn't acknowledging any restriction on her right to speak publicly about her own situation. What exactly did you tell her? Camilla's account of the interview was carefully edited to emphasize her reasonable responses while downplaying the more provocative accusations she had made. But even her sanitized version made clear that she had essentially declared war on the government officials who had criticized her role. Camilla, this could create a serious diplomatic crisis. The government will see this as a direct challenge to their authority. Good. Perhaps they'll think twice before trying to manipulate the royal family for their own political purposes. Charles realized that his wife had fundamentally changed the nature of the conflict. What had been a private disagreement about constitutional boundaries was about to become a public battle over the relationship between the monarchy and the government. You should have discussed this with me before giving any interview, just as you should have discussed your meeting with the Prime Minister before agreeing to it. The accusation stung because it was accurate. Charles had allowed the government to exclude Camilla from discussions about her own future, and now she was reminding him of the consequences of that decision. That night, as Charles tried to sleep, he found himself reviewing every conversation, every decision, every moment that had led to this crisis. He had spent his entire life preparing to be king, but no one had prepared him for the possibility that his wife might become his greatest political liability. Meanwhile, in her own bedroom, Camilla was already planning her next moves. The interview with Rebecca Manning was just the beginning of a campaign that would either secure her position permanently or destroy everything she had worked to build. She had learned decades ago that half measures were often worse than doing nothing at all. If she was going to fight for her position as queen consort, she would do it with every weapon at her disposal and every advantage she could create. The British public would read Rebecca Manning's article in 3 days, and when they did, they would be forced to choose sides in a constitutional crisis that would determine not just Camilla's future, but the future of the modern monarchy itself. Charles would learn over the coming days just how far his wife was prepared to go to protect her position. The government would learn that they had underestimated both her intelligence and her determination. And Margaret Thornfield would learn whether her carefully constructed strategy would save her client or destroy them both. The stakes had never been higher, and the battle was just beginning. The Times article appeared on a Thursday morning with a headline that sent shockwaves through Westminster and Buckingham Palace alike. Queen Consort speaks out. Government ministers monitoring royal family's private conversations. Rebecca Manning's carefully crafted profile had captured every nuance of Camilla's message, presenting her as both a dedicated queen consort and a victim of political overreach. Within hours of the article's publication, Charles's private secretary was fielding urgent calls from Downing Street, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and several senior members of Parliament. The Queen Consort had essentially accused the government of constitutional impropriety, and the political establishment was reacting with a mixture of outrage and panic. Charles read the article in his study while his breakfast grew cold on the table beside him. Every paragraph made him more aware of how completely his wife had outmaneuvered both him and the government officials who had sought to constrain her influence. She had turned defense into attack, victimhood into strength, and constitutional concern into political overreach. The most damaging aspect of the article wasn't any single accusation, but rather the overall impression it created that the Queen Consort was being unfairly persecuted by jealous politicians who resented her effectiveness and influence. Rebecca Manning had woven together Camilla's quotes with carefully selected background information to create a narrative that would resonate powerfully with public opinion. The Queen Consort's charitable work has expanded significantly since her husband's accession to the throne, Manning had written. Her involvement with domestic violence charities, literacy programs, and animal welfare organizations reflects a modern approach to royal duty that has won widespread public approval. Yet sources suggest that this very success has made some government officials uncomfortable with what they perceive as her growing influence. The suggestion that Camilla was being punished for her effectiveness was particularly clever, as it appealed to anyone who had ever felt their own success had been resented by others. The article positioned her critics as small-minded politicians threatened by a competent woman. But it was the quotes from unnamed sources that would cause the most immediate political damage. One government insider, speaking on condition of anonymity, suggested that the Queen Consort's political opinions are sought and valued by the king in ways that previous Queen Consorts were not. This source described her influence as unprecedented and potentially problematic, though they acknowledged that she has done nothing technically improper. The anonymous criticism actually strengthened Camilla's position by making her opponents appear unwilling to state their concerns publicly, while confirming that she had indeed become an influential figure within the royal family. The article made her critics look both cowardly and petty. Margaret Thornfield arrived at Clarence House that morning to find Camilla in a mood of controlled triumph. The initial reaction to the article had exceeded their most optimistic projections. Social media responses were overwhelmingly supportive of the Queen Consort, with many users expressing outrage at the suggestion that she was being monitored or controlled by government officials. "The polling data we're getting is extraordinary," Margaret reported. 73% of respondents believe the Queen Consort should be free to offer private advice to the king. 81% disapprove of government officials monitoring royal family conversations. And, most importantly, her personal approval ratings have actually increased since the article appeared. But Margaret also brought warnings about the political backlash that was building in Westminster. "The Prime Minister is furious. He believes you've deliberately misrepresented the government's legitimate constitutional concerns as political persecution. He's demanding a meeting with the king immediately." "Let him demand," Camilla replied. "Charles will have to decide whether he wants to support his wife or appease politicians who are trying to undermine the royal family's independence." The confidence in her voice masked the very real anxiety she felt about Charles's reaction to her public offensive. She had gambled everything on the assumption that success would vindicate her strategy, but she couldn't be certain that Charles would see it that way. When Charles finally confronted her about the article later that morning, his anger was controlled but unmistakable. "Camilla, you've created a constitutional crisis. The Prime Minister is talking about calling for a parliamentary inquiry into royal family protocols. You've forced me into a position where I have to choose between supporting you publicly and maintaining the working relationship with government that the monarchy requires to function. I've forced you to choose between your wife and politicians who want to control and diminish us both," she corrected. "And I think the British public has made clear which choice they believe is the right one." She was referring to the flood of supportive messages that had poured in since the article's publication. Letters to royal residences, social media posts, and even some newspaper editorials had rallied to her defense, creating a groundswell of public support that would be difficult for any government to ignore. "Public support doesn't resolve constitutional questions, Camilla. The monarchy's survival depends on maintaining proper relationships with all branches of government, not just popular approval. The monarchy's survival depends on remaining relevant and respected. If we allow politicians to micromanage our private conversations and family relationships, we become puppets instead of constitutional monarchs." The argument continued through the morning, with both Charles and Camilla becoming more entrenched in their positions. She saw the political pressure as an attack that required a strong response. He saw her public campaign as a dangerous escalation that threatened the careful balance between royal independence and constitutional propriety. Meanwhile, the political crisis was intensifying beyond anything either of them had anticipated. The Prime Minister's office issued a statement expressing concern about recent public comments that appeared to mischaracterize legitimate constitutional oversight as political interference. The statement was diplomatically worded but unmistakably critical. Opposition politicians seized on the controversy to demand greater transparency in royal family operations. Several MPs called for parliamentary hearings on royal protocols, while others suggested that the Queen Consort's role needed to be more formally defined and limited. Margaret Thornfield spent the afternoon managing the media response, granting carefully controlled access to supportive journalists while declining to escalate the rhetoric further. Her strategy was to maintain public sympathy for Camilla while allowing the government to damage itself through overreaction. "The longer this drags on, the better it is for us," she explained to Camilla during an afternoon strategy session. "Every day that politicians spend attacking a popular Queen Consort is a day that makes them look petty and vindictive." But the government was developing its own counter-strategy. By evening, leaked details of Charles's previous meetings with ministers began appearing in sympathetic newspapers. The leaks were clearly designed to show that the king himself had acknowledged concerns about his wife's role and had agreed to consider restrictions on her activities. The most damaging leak suggested that Charles had privately described some of Camilla's political interventions as unhelpful and had agreed that clearer boundaries needed to be established. Whether the quotes were accurate or not, their appearance in the press created the impression that the king was distancing himself from his wife's public position. Camilla read the leaked quotes over dinner, feeling the first real moment of doubt about her strategy. If Charles was allowing his private reservations to be made public, she might have misjudged both his loyalty and his political courage. Are these quotes accurate, Charles? The meetings they described did happen. The context and specific wording may have been altered, but the basic concerns they reference were indeed discussed. His careful non-denial felt like a betrayal. Camilla had expected political attacks from government officials, but she hadn't anticipated that Charles might undermine her position through strategic leaks to friendly journalists. So you've been briefing against me? I've been participating in constitutionally appropriate discussions with government officials. If those discussions have been leaked, that's unfortunate, but not something I can control. But Camilla suspected that the leaks hadn't happened without Charles's knowledge or consent. The timing and content were too convenient for the government's position to be accidental. That evening, Margaret received urgent calls from several of her media contacts warning that more damaging leaks were being prepared for the following day's newspapers. The government's counterattack was escalating, and it was becoming clear that they intended to destroy Camilla's credibility by portraying her as an out-of-control queen consort whose own husband couldn't manage her political ambitions. We need to prepare for a much more serious assault on your reputation, Margaret warned during a late-night phone call. They're going to try to isolate you completely by making it appear that even Charles considers you a liability. Then, we'll have to remind them that I'm not someone who can be easily isolated or destroyed, Camilla replied. She was already planning her next move, one that would escalate the conflict to a level that would force everyone involved to show their true loyalties. If Charles was going to allow the government to use him against her, she would demonstrate exactly what the consequences of that betrayal would be. The battle for her position as queen consort was about to become a war for the soul of the modern monarchy, and Camilla Parker Bowles was prepared to use every weapon in her considerable arsenal to ensure that she emerged victorious. The stakes could not have been higher, and the next 48 hours would determine whether she would secure her position permanently or lose everything she had spent decades building. The devastating counterattack came in the form of Saturday morning headlines that Margaret Thornfield had spent all night trying to prevent. Palace sources, queen consort's political interference concerns even the king, ran across the front page of 3 major newspapers, accompanied by detailed accounts of private conversations that could only have come from the highest levels of the royal household. Camilla read the articles in her bedroom while Charles was attending an early morning meeting with his private secretary. The leaked quotes painted a picture of a king struggling to control a wife whose political ambitions had begun to threaten the constitutional monarchy itself. One particularly damaging passage quoted Charles as saying that Camilla's interventions in government meetings had become a source of considerable concern and embarrassment. The precision of the quotes and the intimate details they contained made clear that this wasn't random gossip, but a coordinated effort to destroy Camilla's credibility using Charles's own words against her. Someone very close to the king had decided that the queen consort needed to be completely discredited, and they were using her husband's private doubts as their primary weapon. Margaret arrived within the hour, her usually composed demeanor cracked by the magnitude of the crisis they now faced. "This isn't just political opposition anymore," she said without preamble. "This is character assassination from within the royal household itself. Someone with direct access to the king's private conversations has decided to destroy you, and they're using his own words to do it." The betrayal cut deeper than any political attack could have. Camilla had expected opposition from government ministers and political rivals, but she had not anticipated that people within the palace itself would use Charles's private moments of doubt against her. Who had access to those conversations? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. The private secretary, obviously. Possibly the equerry. Maybe 1 or 2 senior household staff who might have overheard discussions. But the level of detail suggests someone who was actually present during the conversations, not someone who heard about them secondhand. The realization that her most intimate enemies were people she saw every day, people who smiled at her and treated her with apparent respect while secretly working to undermine her, was almost overwhelming. The palace that she had thought of as her home was revealed to be a nest of vipers whose loyalty was to the institution rather than to her personally. Charles knows about the leaks. He has to know. The quotes are too specific and too damaging for him not to have been consulted before they were released. Margaret's assessment confirmed Camilla's worst fears. Charles hadn't just failed to protect her from political attacks. He had actively participated in the campaign to discredit her. The man she had married, the man for whom she had endured decades of public hatred and scandal, was now using her own words and actions against her in the most public way possible. When Charles returned from his meetings that afternoon, he found Camilla waiting for him in his private study, surrounded by the morning's newspapers and wearing an expression of cold fury that he had never seen before. "I think we need to discuss your media strategy, Charles." "Camilla, I want you to understand that I had nothing to do with those leaks. Yes, I've had concerns about some aspects of your role, but I never authorized anyone to make those concerns public." "But you didn't prevent them from being made public, did you? When your private secretary or your equerry suggested that my credibility needed to be undermined for the good of the monarchy, you didn't object." Charles's silence was answer enough. He had allowed the leaks to happen, even if he hadn't explicitly authorized them. His desire to preserve the monarchy's relationship with the government had overridden his loyalty to his wife. "This is about more than our marriage, Camilla. This is about the survival of the constitutional monarchy. If the government loses confidence in the royal family's ability to remain above politics, the consequences could be catastrophic. And you've decided that sacrificing me is an acceptable price to pay for maintaining that confidence. I've decided that all of us, including me, are expendable if that's what it takes to preserve the institution." The admission was both honest and devastating. Charles was acknowledging that he valued the monarchy more than his marriage, the institution more than the individual, duty more than love. But Camilla had one final weapon in her arsenal, one that she had hoped never to use. Margaret had prepared this contingency months earlier, understanding that if Camilla's enemies ever succeeded in isolating her completely, she would need something powerful enough to force them back to the negotiating table. "Charles, before you make any final decisions about my future, I think you should know that I've been keeping some insurance for exactly this situation." She opened her handbag and removed a small digital recording device, placing it carefully on the table between them. "For the past several months, I've been recording our private conversations about government matters, political decisions, and constitutional issues. I have Charles, in your own voice, expressing some very candid opinions about ministers, policies, and political figures. Opinions that would be extremely damaging if they became public." Charles stared at the device as if it were a venomous snake. "You've been recording our private conversations?" "I've been protecting myself from exactly the situation we're in now. When people started questioning my role and my influence, I made sure I had evidence of exactly how involved you wanted me to be in political discussions." The recordings were Camilla's nuclear option, and she could see from Charles's expression that he understood exactly what they represented. If she released them, they would prove that the king himself had sought and valued her political opinions, but they would also reveal private royal thoughts on government matters that would destroy Charles's relationship with his ministers. "Those recordings would be as damaging to you as they would be to me," Charles pointed out. "Yes, but I'm already being destroyed, Charles. You're asking me to accept political exile and constitutional irrelevance. If that's my only choice, then I'm prepared to take everyone down with me." The threat was real and immediate. Margaret had already prepared a comprehensive media strategy for releasing the recordings in a way that would maximize their political impact. The Queen Consort was essentially threatening to detonate the entire constitutional relationship between the monarchy and the government if she wasn't allowed to retain her position and influence. "What do you want, Camilla?" "I want an end to the leaks and the background briefings against me. I want a public statement from the palace confirming that I have the king's full confidence and support. And I want a clear acknowledgement that the Queen Consort's role in the 21st century includes appropriate consultation on matters of mutual interest. And if I refuse, then, tomorrow morning, Rebecca Manning will receive copies of our most interesting conversations, along with a detailed explanation of how the palace has been conspiring to undermine the Queen Consort for political convenience." Charles realized that his wife had outmaneuvered him completely. She had anticipated this moment from the beginning, preparing for the possibility that he might choose political expedience over personal loyalty. The recordings were her guarantee that if he betrayed her, he would pay a price that made the current crisis look trivial. You've planned this entire campaign from the beginning, haven't you? I've protected myself from people who I suspected might eventually try to sacrifice me for political convenience. Unfortunately, I was right to be suspicious. The conversation continued for another hour, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Charles could not risk the constitutional catastrophe that would result from the public release of their private conversations. The recordings would destroy not just his relationship with the current government, but his ability to work with any future government. By Sunday morning, the palace had issued a carefully worded statement expressing the king's full confidence in the queen consort and acknowledging the valuable contributions she made to royal duties. The statement didn't address the specific political concerns that had triggered the crisis, but it made clear that Camilla retained her husband's support and would continue in her current role. The government ministers who had sought to constrain Camilla's influence found themselves in the awkward position of appearing to have lost a battle with the queen consort. Their attempt to use constitutional concerns as a weapon against her had backfired, leaving them looking both ineffective and petty. Margaret Thornfield watched the resolution of the crisis with professional satisfaction. Her client had not only survived a coordinated attack from the highest levels of government, but had emerged from the battle stronger than before. The threat of the recordings would provide ongoing protection against future attempts to undermine Camilla's position. But the victory had come at an enormous personal cost. The trust between Charles and Camilla had been shattered by the revelation that each had been prepared to betray the other for political advantage. Their marriage would continue, but it would never again be based on the assumption of mutual loyalty that had sustained them through decades of scandal and controversy. Charles understood that he was now essentially a prisoner of his wife's ambition and preparation. The recordings ensured that he could never again consider sacrificing her position for political convenience. But they also meant that their relationship had become a form of mutually assured destruction. Camilla had won the battle for her position as queen consort, but she had lost something perhaps more valuable in the process. The man she had loved enough to endure decades of public hatred had proven willing to destroy her when political pressure became intense enough. The victory was complete, but it felt hollow. The constitutional crisis passed, the media attention moved on to other scandals, and the British public gradually forgot about the brief moment when the relationship between the monarchy and the government had seemed to hang in the balance. But within the walls of Clarence House and Buckingham Palace, everyone understood that something fundamental had changed. The queen consort had demonstrated that she possessed the intelligence, the preparation, and the ruthlessness necessary to protect her position against any threat. She had also demonstrated that she was willing to use those qualities against anyone who threatened her, including her own husband. The modern monarchy would continue to function, the government would find ways to work around constitutional concerns, and the public would continue to support both the king and the queen consort. But the people involved would never forget the lessons learned during those few days when the mask had slipped, and everyone had seen exactly how much power Camilla Parker Bowles was prepared to wield to protect what she had spent a lifetime building. The game was over, but the consequences would echo through the remaining years of Charles's reign and beyond. Camilla had secured her position permanently, but she had done so in a way that ensured that everyone around her understood exactly what she was capable of when threatened. The queen consort had won, but the victory had revealed truths about the modern monarchy that were far more disturbing than any of the constitutional concerns that had originally triggered the crisis.